So we've gone from North Africa, from Dr. Abdelaziz's homeland, and Sister Malia's homeland, which is Algeria. We're going right down to the south of the continent now, and we really are honored and privileged to welcome someone who fought, as the brothers was discussing before, literally in the bush, in the guerrilla struggle against another British instituted white settler colonial regime in so-called, what do they call it, Rhodesia or something, named after some genocidal maniac from Britain, like Churchill and these other crazies, all right? So anyway, with no more further ado, and it has to be said as well that Zimbabwe is still on the front line in Africa. It's a frontline state in the revolutionary struggle throughout the whole global south. It came out in recent months that Blair's new Labour government was planning a military regime change operation against Zimbabwe, and that came out recently as well. So it's still very much on the front line. It's still suffering sanctions. Please welcome Dr. George Shire to the microphone. Thank you.
From the land to the sea. From the land to the sea. From the land to the sea.
Palestine will be free.
We are all Palestinians.
We are all
We are all Palestinians.
We are all Palestinians.
Thank you. Thank you very much for asking me to come and share this afternoon. I hope it won't be the last. And I want to emphasize that it won't be the last for each one of us to take on the responsibility of what it means to call ourselves, we are all Palestinians now. Let me begin just by making some biographical remarks. I spent my childhood and adolescence in what was Southern Rhodesia. In fact, I was born at a time just before it was called the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. I know I look black-skinned, don't crack, but I was born just after the Second World War, and I was born literally just about the same time as Palestine was being chopped up. I grew in a family that were very much involved after the Second World War in the formation of national liberation movements or national independence movements after the Second World War. To my parents and their friends, Palestine was their twin. And indeed, of all the national liberation movements that have dominated the last century, Palestine, the Palestinian Revolution, still remains one of those unfinished businesses. We need to remember that. The place I was born, I always describe myself as somebody who escaped the place I was born. If you were born and spent your childhood and adolescence in the Rhodesias that I grew up, you couldn't stay there. You just had to leave. I escaped. I escaped, like any members of my generation, to join the armed struggle. And the reason I joined the armed struggle was because my grandparents had told me how our own land, where my great-great-grandfather is buried, had been turned into white land, and we couldn't visit that gravesite to honor our respects. So from very early age, from when I was about 4 or 5, my grandfather always used to remind us to go back and visit where my grandfather, Great-grandfather is buried. Those of you who've read History of Zimbabwe, there's a book called Zimbabwe Takes Its Lands Back. Paragraph 102 of that begins with a reference to my own work about George Shire talking about his grandfather's land. And that is really a very thing that shaped my thinking. And the land was taken. Nobody in Southern Africa, or at least in Southern Africa, can describe who they are without also simultaneously talking about which bit of the country from. Now, I know perhaps 50 years from now, people will say someone is from Harare and 4th Street. In my generation, you are associated with an area, a land, a piece of a hill, a river, a tree, a neighborhood in that sense. And if you're not connected in that way, you do not have any sense of humanity. So the taking away of our land immediately meant it took away our sense of humanity, of being human. The very reason of being involved in the armed struggle for us was, on one hand, to claim our dignity, yes, and at the same time to become human and get our land back. We also, I was one of those few people who was present at the first press conference of ZANU in August 1963, aspiring teenager, aspiring, into rock and roll like everybody else was. Which reminds me, today is the anniversary of the death of Miles Davis. But at the time, it was kind of we associated with modernities in a different way. Okay? We associated with those other forms of counterculture which were in resistance, but not necessarily in resistance to us. And as a young person, you couldn't stay in square Southern Rhodesia or square South Africa. You had to join the armed struggle. You had to leave, both to liberate oneself, but also be engaged in the armed struggle proper. So my journey of living Southern Africa, from that escape, apart from my own peculiar education and training, was through ZANU, then joining Frelimo, and at Morogoro refugee camp in Tanzania, where most of us trained, we met a whole range of other networks of people who were involved in our struggle. That is where the friendships between ZANU, the MPLA, Frelimo, Mkonto Siso, the Lumumbaists, and so on, were shaped and formed. And it is through those solidarities that we also began to learn about Tripoli, about Tunisia, about the Palestinian liberation movement. It is through those networks that took me to visit Damascus. It was through those connections that I began firsthand to learn what happened in Shadrach Tortilla. It was through those networks I began to understand the interconnectedness of struggle. We didn't have a fetish for violence. We didn't think of violence in the way in which people think. We thought of violence, we thought of the colonial story, if you accept that coloniality is so total and violent, then the only way in which we could do was to decolonial experience is too violent. It is not the same as a fetish for violence. Okay? It is not the same as a love affair of killing people. Okay? There is nothing glorious about death. There just isn't. There is some value in reclaiming one's dignity and humanity and sense of self. It is within that essence we told ourselves in ZANU we were our own liberators. We are our own liberators. Some people might come out to support us, but we were in the driving seat. If I come to your house and I said, I've come to help you, whatever you're doing, you say, welcome to me, George. If I come to your house and said, I've come to intervene to tell you how to live, I give you permission to shoot me. Because those two keywords are very different. We see the reproduction of that at the moment, particularly as the horror of the Middle East begins to emerge. Assistance, the difference between assistance and intervention. Assistance works on the basis of mutuality. Intervention does not. But why am I returning to this question now in 2014, having spent the last God knows how many decades doing something else? Well, very, very simple. In 1980, when Zimbabwe became independent, I was a young graduate student, and everybody else went back to the country, and I decided I couldn't drive a milk float. So I had to find a job. I found myself teaching cultural studies. So I'm not one of these people who wrote at the back of an envelope that I'm going to do intellectual work. It sort of happened that way. It happened partly at a moment there were black struggles going on in this country. I had found a home inside black politics. And the question about learning and teaching in black politics had to face attention to the organization of knowledge itself. So my own intellectual life became intertwined with the unfinished business of politics. So I remained in that vein. I found a home. The second thing that happened is that the question of Zimbabwe returned with a vengeance, not in the context into it being in 1980, But now, in the moment of neoliberalism, in which something else more nasty, nastier than before even, had re-emerged, a different problem space. So on one hand is the re-emergence of neoliberalism, on another is the unfinished business of national liberation movement in as far as Palestine is concerned. In the middle of that is a laboratory. Israel to me is a laboratory. Just like Africa used to be a laboratory that produced the plantation, the factory, and coloniality, right? Now, you see, Auschwitz is not the apogee that comes out of the Second World War. Apogee is rehearsed in Namibia at the turn of the other century. Okay, what goes on in Israel is a dress rehearsal for something else. You know, Israel can just easily goes and bombs another country, and they say it's okay in international law. It's rehearsed. Nobody says it. The United States picks it up. That's exactly the same. You see this place as the laboratory in which all kinds which affect us all are rehearsed. So once you begin to see what is on the rehearsal, then those people who are resisting that force is the route through which we've become Palestinians. We've become Palestinians because we're the only people who are talking about what is being produced and reproduced by this laboratory. The notion of international law begins to mean something quite different after Israel than it would elsewhere. Can you imagine? Somebody said 200 nuclear arms on one hand, and a bow and arrow, a rocket made out of a broomstick. And people call that a war? Is it? Can you imagine someone comes into your house, occupies it by force, and then they ask you that you must guarantee their security? Well, there is something going on, and international law is being written like that. That's what I mean by the dress rehearsal. That's what, and the implications for that, not there, but here, are real. We are in a very, very dangerous moment, and I don't really want to freak you out by that. What I mean by this, on one hand is the militarization. What feels like the dead end of the Euro-American archive in its violent form is the militarization of the world through the United States, on one hand. On another is the provincialization of Europe. It's a little province, which is almost like it hankers for a kind of old apartheid in a new form, securitate, create this community with borders in which a certain number of people are not allowed to move, okay? And so you have this state on one hand being very regulative around questions of immigration, movement of people, and so on. And at the same time, precariousness, no housing, no bridges, no infrastructure, no jobs, no whatever, at the same time. We are in that nightmare. On one hand, the state tells that it can't feed the poor, and they can find 34 billion pounds to go and blow up people in the middle of nowhere. We are in that dangerous moment. So the question of solidarity, from learning from the South, into the north, and by that I mean those of us, see, Europe ought to exercise a moratorium on telling anybody they're going to think. There's a lot more to be gained by that spirit of the liberation movement, the spirit of Bandung, the spirit of the global south, into the West. Into the West is not a geographical condition. You know, it is not a geographical. You know, Japan is to the east as you can get. It's in the West. We need to think about the West not just as a kind of geography, but the way in which we live our lives are exactly the sites and spaces that we occupy have become and should become the moment in which we begin to recognize that we become all Palestinians. I want to just draw you to the images that you may or may not see on television. You don't see on the queues of people going through borders, fit men or old men like me. You should do, but you don't. What you see are women and children. There is something going on the body of the female subject in our time. At exactly on one hand, we think, Feminisms have made some successes. There are some people, there are more and more people in the basement dying, unable to get out. And unless we see the link, particularly about who has become the real casualties of both war and precarious life as women and children, we have yet to begin. So we become Palestinians in that real sense. We become Palestinians in that real sense. Of course, the masculinities that shape Ferguson or Tottenham or whatever it is are rampant in another direction. They're important. I don't want to lose sight on that. But the real question, the real challenge for us is to think with the image of the body of the female subject as the site in which a new configuration of a particular chaotic precariousness of death and misery is being constructed. So those are some of the lessons I learned from the South. During the war, it was not a joke. I'm not suggesting it should be a fetish. It was no pleasure. I used to know how to make a bomb, and I'm not suggesting one should. I do want us to think seriously and come out. You know, if I was Scotland, and I was in Scotland last couple of weeks, I wish I hadn't been, I would have voted yes. So I belong to that constituency that would have wanted to see this thing that's called the empire finally finished. Because at least to the people of Glasgow, if they were thinking of us today, they would not have sanctioned what has just happened, supposedly in our name, in the House of Commons. So I urge you again to think again. I urge, thinking is something I wish I couldn't do. I don't know how to live without making sense of the chaos of our world. I would love to have a day off from it. I don't know how to. That's the one thing that I know how to do. I know how to do it. I know it pays my bills sometimes. And I'm lucky perhaps to be able to do politics and teaching at the same time. And I'm not expecting everybody to do. But it does matter a great deal that we grapple with understanding how the world has got to where it is, if we are to be able to understand what to do with it. And I don't think I am an incomplete subject without somebody else. I cannot live on my own. The idea of a single subject, full, complete, born aware. You know, the idea that there is such a thing as a feminist that can be born outside of women's studies is something I don't understand. You have to learn that stuff, yes? You have to learn the world. We have to learn the world in which we live in. We have to learn the living, if anything, so that we can be at the barricades properly. Okay? And a great deal of the war that's going on is not just about resources, fresh water, and so on. It's not just about authority, important. You know, there's the numbers of American military bases across the world are huge. You know, you can count on about 4 or 5 countries on the planet where there are no American military bases. Zimbabwe is one of them. It hasn't got one yet. The struggle of authority is important that way. The second is the struggle of a public sphere. Okay, that is to say the ethics and moralities in which we can adopt in order to live one another. Okay, I'm interested in those sides, and I'm counting them. The last one is I call knowledge and subjectivity. I'm interested in those sides, not as just given from a decolonial, de-Western impulse. Now, de-Western is a tricky word. It doesn't mean anti-Western. It means, at best, borrow from each other those things that work from a spirit of convivial mutuality. That's why the contents of unity and solidarity across genders, across race, matters. Okay? That enables us to escape from the essentialism of a sort of single-minded notion that somehow in the body of George Shire is the eternal truth. There isn't. You know, there is the real is about how the incomplete subject that makes me can live with Hamlet. Yes, it's that is the more different you are to me, the more important it becomes to live convivially in that sense. And I think we can learn that from listening from the Global South. If there's anything about the Global South, nobody could eat dinner on their own. It's unheard of. It's not in the language. It's not in the ensemble of the everyday. It's not in the notion of communal complexity sharing. Is precisely decentering the way in which we make sense of the world. And that's what I understand mutuality to mean. So, de-Western means to me, means borrowing from all sorts, accompanied with a decolonial impulse, a different matrix of power. Okay? There's a lot of difference between white people and the whiteness of power. Okay? As I'm renowned to know, sometimes I say, what's black about the Cosby Show? I haven't got a clue. Okay, so if you think about it, we need to rethink the way in which we think that question. We need to think about how we think these relations. And I end by urging you to yet again learn from the South. Thank you. Free Palestine!